Hello, everybody. Welcome to ClimaTalk's first event in the pre-COP30 series. We're so happy that you can be here and join us today. I'm especially excited as I think this event will really deploy some important learnings. If you're aiming to attend or virtually track or keep up with the upcoming COP30 conference in any way this November, then I think that this event should be right up your alley because it will really help lay that foundation for what has happened since COP29 last year in Azerbaijan, and where some of the hottest topics and negotiations will be focused on. And so we have a lot to talk about. So but let's just dive right in. Before moving on to the agenda, I just want to give a quick introduction to myself. My name is Annabelle. I'm a Taiwanese Canadian youth activist and sustainability enthusiast, and I'm the community engagement and events lead at ClimaTalk this year. I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm calling in and facilitating this event today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nation people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial and who we should be really looking towards alongside Indigenous peoples everywhere for their traditional knowledge and climate solutions. I'd like to pass it off to Karen and Teresa as well to give a quick introduction of yourselves. Karen, if you wanted to go first.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. I think there's some feedback. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining in. My name is Karen Namonje. I am a Zambian environmental activist working in the climate smart agriculture space, and I am very big on green foreign policy and tracking climate policy and how that impacts local communities. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. I'll pass it on to Teresa.
Hi everyone, my name is Teresa Mbewe. I'm from Malawi and I work in intersection of environment and climate, SRHR, as well as gender justice and climate policy as well. So I'll walk you through guys through the roles and damage. So stay tuned for more updates and more news from me. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both. We can move on to the next slide, speed running through this agenda. We're just going to get an intro to what ClimaTalk is as an organization and what we do with our annual COP project and dive into a brief history of the UNFCCC and the significance of the Bonn SBs before we move on to the presentation of three of our fact sheets on climate finance, loss and damage, and Article 6. And then we'll end this event with an opportunity for dialogue, and we're all really looking forward to hearing from you. And to make this the best experience for everyone, next slide, please. I'm just going to ask that participants are muted while presenters are speaking. And so if you have any questions, feel free to record them in the Zoom chat, and we would love to discuss them during the breakouts. We encourage your questions, your ideas, any comments you have, and request that we're all respectful and kind towards each other. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it to the founder and CEO of ClimaTalk, Emma.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. Well, maybe before I start, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. Let us know where you're calling in from and where you're based or any other things that you would like to share with our fellow panelists and also your participants. It's great to see everyone here. I founded ClimaTalk about 5 years ago because I noticed that young people make up the largest generation in history. Many feel very worried about climate change. I think we can all relate. And yet again, we are really not taught enough in our educational systems. I at least felt not equipped to talk about climate policy. I felt very lost. I felt very overwhelmed at the time. So I really thought that we need an accessible platform created by young people for young people to help everyone engage in climate policy and bring as many young people as possible into the climate policy space because it is our future after all. So at ClimaTalk, we demystify climate policy and we empower young people in the fight for climate action. We make climate policy accessible, we make it digestible, we make it actionable. what we've done is we've created a team of over 100 young volunteers in over 30 countries all around the world, on 6 continents. So really amazing young people, some of which you will be able to hear at the panel later today. We've created a youth-led climate publication where we have written hundreds of short, accessible, and scientifically referenced articles in over 15 critical areas of climate policy. All the articles have been edited, have been referenced, and they have reached many young people around the world so far, which is fantastic to see. We have also created a global university courses map. So this is a filtered database of university courses in and around climate policy, both undergraduate and postgraduate, which you can find on our website. It is freely accessible, and we have really tried to research some of the key courses that we were able to find around the world. We've also put together a youth climate lawsuits database. This is a database where we have researched cases brought by young people against governments and corporations around the world fighting for climate justice. And we have made these cases accessible, and we've tried to really break them down also for people with a non-legal background. And now to our COP work. So our COP project is probably our biggest project that we've had, and that we are still conducting today. We have conducted award-winning live coverage from now 7 international climate conferences. So this has been between COP26 up to the Bonn conference in June, and now we're just preparing for COP30. In total, we've produced over 450 pieces of COP content, really trying to make the conference and the negotiations accessible to as many young people as possible. So we break down the negotiations. We try to help young people track negotiations as easily as possible that are happening, but we also work on amplifying youth voices on the ground. So we conduct many interviews with young people directly on the ground at these conferences to amplify their voices and spotlight their work. Great. And yes, if you're not doing so already, which I think many of you might since you heard about this webinar, but if not, please do follow us for updates. We've got lots of exciting things planned, especially now in the lead up to COP30. So would really appreciate also any ideas you might have or anything that you think would help you in your personal journey and understanding climate policy journey as well. Thank you everyone for joining. And I think I will already pass back to you, Annabelle.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So back to me to talk about the significance of the Bonn SBs. Before we do, though, just want to very quickly highlight how the UN Climate Change Conferences work. If we could go to the next slide. So how do COPs work? The COP is the highest decision-making body, and it enables countries to assess progress, negotiate agreements, and set climate targets. I'm sure a number of you in this call are already very familiar with this, but one of the most notable ones, COP21 in 2015, that was where the Paris Agreement was kind of passed and signed, and parties there aimed limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And so following that, a lot of the COPs have been focused on actually making that happen and driving progress towards that goal. If we could go to the next slide. So, but obviously, if the world only met once a year to make goals and then radio silence for the rest of the year, that's not extremely productive. And that's where the SBs, also known as the subsidiary bodies, come in. So throughout the year, countries focus on implementing their climate commitments that they would have made at COPs. They report on progress and they build capacity. There's some pre-COP negotiations to refine climate strategies, update their commitments, and then address outstanding issues as well. So you can kind of see a complicated diagram illustrating how various governance bodies are related to each other. If we could go to the next slide. So essentially, the subsidiary bodies known as the SBs are the technical negotiating tracks under the UNFCCC. They meet twice a year in Bonn, Germany, once mid-year. This is known as the Bonn Climate Conference, also known as the SBs, and this is what the fact sheets will be covering, is what happened in June earlier this year, and then once alongside COP. And so there are two main bodies. The next slide will go over what these two main bodies are. The one is the SBSTA, otherwise known as the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice. And so this looks at the science, tech, and methodologies behind climate action. So they might focus on things such as reporting systems, emissions accounting, and new technology innovations. The second one is the Subsidiary Body for Implementation, or SBI, and this focuses on how commitments are actually carried out. So looking at things like transparency, finance, capacity building, and support for developing countries. We can go to the next slide. So highlights from SB62, going to speed through some highlights just so you can get a picture of what actually happened and some real life recent examples of what took place at a Bonn SB conference. In terms of the global stock date, known as the GST, parties debated how to operationalize the outcome of the first GST from COP28. Climate finance, there were ongoing negotiations on the related new collective quantified goal on climate finance. For the mitigation work program, there was a focus on how to ramp up near-term emissions cuts before 2030, with a lot of tensions over fairness, responsibility, and national circumstances. We can go to the next slide. There's just three more really quick updates. On adaptation, the global goal on adaptation framework was debated with a focus on indicators, metrics, and how to ensure adequate finance and support. Article 6, which I'll be speaking a bit more later, how international carbon trading systems should work was kind of the center of the conversation there. And then in terms of the Just Transition Work Program, how to integrate just transition strategies into national policies and connect that to jobs and equity and social protection. So we can go to the next slide. So ending off, why do the SBs matter? They allow negotiators to work through details without the political spotlight. You can probably see that COP every year gets a lot more attention and press, so that ministers and heads of state can actually focus on big picture decisions at COP. For observers, and this includes folks like youth, civil society, researchers, Bonn is a really key moment to engage and push for transparency as well, just like we do at COP, and influence how technical decisions and issues are framed before they reach that political stage. SB62, so the one in June, set the tone for COP30, where two big deliverables are expected, the new climate finance goal and pathways for increased ambition post-GST. So hopefully that gives you a comprehensive overview of the role of SBs in pacing progress and engaging governments in between COPs. Remember, if you have any questions, to feel free to pop them into the chat, and I'll now pass it on to Karen to talk about climate finance.
Thank you, Annabelle. I'm just getting my video back on, but I'll just quickly get started. Next slide, please. Recording in progress. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So just to get started with the conversation, my focus is going to be on, first of all, my experience tracking climate finance as an online delegate. And then we'll talk about what were the outcomes of the SB62, and then we can look at what the COP30 outcomes are. Next slide. Okay, first of all, my tracking experience, what that entails is analyzing negotiations and meetings and texts and following country group positions and translating that technical outcomes into insights that inform policy and advocacy. So in short, in terms of climate finance, I was tracking who's promising funds, who's asking for them, and what are the rules that are put in place to ensure that that money actually reaches the right places. So a starting point for this is I had a few questions that I asked myself at the beginning in order to be able to effectively track climate finance. And the first was, I would refer you to the last bubble, which is what terminologies should I be aware of? That was my starting point. There are so many terminologies in the climate finance space. And so as a starting point, I had to know roughly what am I dealing with? What are the terminologies that are often used in climate finance? Then back to the first bubble, which is what are the prevailing debates on climate finance, just to know where exactly I'm starting from. And so in this case, I had to go back to the COP29 outcomes of climate finance and just see where did the conference end, in what were the agreements, what were the operational tools put in place, and then what part of the Paris Agreement speak to climate finance. This is particularly important because most often meetings are not really tagged climate finance. Sometimes it will be Article 9.1, implementation of various articles. So it does help to know which particular parts of the Paris Agreement really do align with climate finance. The third was what events, meetings are relevant or open to track. Then what sites report on and break down climate finance. This is important. Sites like Carbon Brief, and if you're not already with ClimaTalk, I would highly recommend coming to ClimaTalk and just seeing how climate finance has been broken down for easy understanding. Then who can I speak to or reach out to on the subject? I had a partner in tracking climate finance, but alternatively, there's so many people that are tracking, so many people that are interested in the conversation on climate finance. You can look that up on in your nationality, for example, teachers, lecturers, LinkedIn profiles that you can just look up to. And finally, what negotiations text drafts are available on the official website. So all these questions together were able to frame my approach to tracking climate finance. And then I was able to use that information to just simplify briefs and update the policy fact sheet. Next slide, please. So what were the SB62 outcomes on climate finance? Just as a disclaimer of some sort, most of the climate negotiations really did lead to private and public financing as sources. Whatever conversation was on climate finance really did lead to where would the money come from. That was really a huge conversation, a huge debate around climate finance. So I just put that there to just take note as we go ahead in the conversation. You'll be able to just follow that. Number one of the theme debates was on the 1.3 trillion road to Belém. So the overarching debate here was that most of the parties insisted, most country groups insisted that there should be a reaffirmation of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement by creating a dedicated work program and clarifying rules for countries. This goes back to where would the money come from. While other parties did argue that most of this should be public finance, other parties argued that that is not sustainable and that we needed to extend the climate finance source into private sector in order to be able to meet the scale of investment that is needed for climate action. An outcome on this conversation was that countries did agree to increase the UNFCCC's core budget by about 10% for the 2026-2027, bringing it to 81.5 million. Next slide. Another conversation was the NCQG. This one was, they put a pin on these negotiations last year during the COP29, and it was going to be finalized during the SB62. This is where countries need to move from 100 billion commitment of the developed countries to 300 billion per year. This is post 2025. That was the target that was set under this. However, the debate was that this was still too low to meet the demand, the scale of investment that is needed. And so negotiations were redirected to the $1.3 trillion. And then the outcome on this is that even though it has been understood to include various components of the climate action, that includes the loss and damage fund and the adaptation, the funding sources were not finalized. Operationalization of this was not finalized. So this is still something that we will look up to in the COP30. Then And then when we come to the adaptation finance and loss and damage fund, this was also a huge conversation in climate finance. While a country and parties like the Arab group did suggest directing funds from the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol to adaptation finance, others did propose that adaptation finance should also be designed in a way that funds can be released at least 6 days from the date of request. This is to just also state that most of these funds is for emergencies, climate emergencies. And so an overarching request on this one was that money should be very easily accessible. So the outcomes here is that even though indicators were advanced in adaptation and loss and damage, this is equity, this is inclusion, the operationalization of the adaptation fund was still not finalized. There was still no full consensus on how this money would be rolled out, where it would sit, how it would be accessed, and who really would be in charge of it. So this was still not finalized. Next slide, please. And so as we look up to the COP30, in summary, what we're really asking is COP30 should and must answer a few questions, which is where will the money come from? Because there's still a huge debate on this. What proportion of the finance will be grants versus loans? If there is a push for private sector, a lot of the parties have argued that most developing countries are already in debt. And so what proportion of this money will be grants and what proportion of this will be concession of financing? Number 3, COP30 must answer how accessible will these funds be? If these funds are to be accessed by governments, there should be consideration of all the bureaucratic barriers that are put in place for governments to be able, just even within most national governments, they have a lot of bureaucracies. And so if we're talking loss and damage fund, if we're talking adaptation fund, which is mostly in emergent issues, how will these processes be put in place? And number 4, what are the safeguards so that the finance does not deepen debt vulnerabilities for developing countries? If we are going to split the sourcing between private and public, we need to be to also answer that question. Because most of these developing countries already are in debt. And so private financing would, in most cases, be in form of loans. So these 4 questions are very crucial for the COP30 to be able to answer if we are to move forward with climate finance in a way that really does help communities and people on the ground that are really affected by climate issues. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for such a detailed and wonderful presentation, Karen. Remember the climate finance fact sheet alongside all of our other fact sheets on Bonn SB62 can be found on ClimaTalk's website. Next up, I'd like to have Teresa presenting on loss and damage.
I hope I'm audible enough because I think I'm experiencing some network issues. So confirm if I'm audible.
Yeah, you sound great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Teresa. I'm from Malawi. And today I'll walk you through the discussion on loss and damage from the Bonn Climate Conference, SB62. So loss and damage is one of the most urgent issues in climate negotiations because it's about the real impact of climate change that cannot be avoided, even if we adapt or maybe reduce emissions. So in these short sessions, I will explain what loss and damage actually means, what progress and gaps came out of SB62, and what big issues we're calling forward to COP30 in Belém. So think of it as a story where we're now what was achieved in Bonn and where the next big decisions must be made. Yeah, next slide. Okay. Yeah. So just to start, to give maybe a quick background about what loss and damage is. So this refers to some harm that go beyond adaptations. This includes cyclones, floods, or maybe heat waves that mostly affects most communities in the world. So this is not just about avoiding climate change, but this is about paying for and maybe reducing to the damage that is already happening in our communities and all over the world. So at Bonn, my law was to carefully follow the negotiations, which countries were promising support and how people are going to get the support and which people are requesting it. So in most importantly, how the financial mechanism were being designed maybe to make sure that help actually reaches the right communities, that the help must not just be in the papers, but it should be really working on the ground. So for example, some developed countries wanted some rules languages around contributions, while developing countries, especially the most vulnerable communities, maybe insisted on the predictable and grant-based funding. So part of my job was to track this tug of war and note what each and every side of the country was pushing for. Next slide. Yeah. So I'm going to explain some of the outcomes that come out from Bonn SB62. So these outcomes were somehow mixed. Some were positive, while some also were disappointing. So on the positive side, the Santiago network was declared fully operational. This means that countries can now request technical assistance, like maybe experts and some advices to design maybe programs for recovery and resilience. So for example, a country hit by repeated flooding could use maybe the network to access technical expertise on building stronger early warning systems or maybe community relocation plans. So that's progress. But the challenge remains finance because most of the developed countries did not agree on new financial commitments. So there was no consensus on whether the funding should be delivered as grants or maybe loans, because if it will be loans, then it will add a burden to the debt that some of the countries already have. So because of these disagreements, no final decisions was reached on the fund responding to loss and damage. Instead, negotiators maybe just produced an informal note that will be taken forward to COP30. So at this stage, we have the structure, but not the money. So it's like having a car without an engine. With an engine, but no fuel, so it can actually take us anywhere. So yeah, that's all of the outcomes that were in SB62 Bonn. And next slide, please. So looking ahead, the routers will be in COP30 in Belém. There are 4 big that we're really looking forward to. One, it should be the continuation of the WIM negotiations. So this is a framework that keeps loss and damage moving forward. And also we have to look on finalization of the fund rules, because we already know that we'll have funds if some people share their commitments to it in COP30. So basically, the decision exactly on how the finance is going to be used on the loss and damage fund will function. So we really need to follow up on this thing. And also thirdly, strengthening the Santiago network, it should be since it's already operational, but then it's not practical yet, and maybe it's not timely. So we really need to work on making such technical help practical and timely as well. And also establishing clear accountability. So people are going to promise a lot of things according on the commitments of us, but are they going to be transparent and maybe traceable and deliver what they already pledged? So from this, we get like 5 key questions. Next slide, sorry. We have some key questions that we are delivering to COP30 to answer. So who will provide the funds and how much money will actually be made available? And how will the people reach local communities quickly and maybe fairly? Because sometimes it's like if people share their commitments that they're going to provide finance to specific countries. So it's not usually timely and maybe practical. So how will technical support be delivered in practice? That will be the question that we need to ask at COP30. And finally, how will we ensure that accountability, that the people who are pledging don't just say stay on paper, but it should be working on the ground. So if COP30 doesn't answer these specific questions, then the worsen damage agenda risk becoming just another promise without maybe an impact. But if it does, then that means it will mark a historical breakthrough for vulnerable countries as well. Maybe accessing these funds will make specific countries also maybe to move forward, because on issues concerning climate, it's really hard. Like here in Malawi in 2020, we had like a lot of damages because of cyclones. So you can see like the most vulnerable communities were the most affected as well. So you can see that this is a very big issue. So just to wrap up, SB62 showed some progress, of course, especially with the Santiago network becoming fully operational. But the key issue of finance remains unresolved. And without money, loss and damage cannot save its purpose that we'll be aiming for. So that's why all eyes are now on COP30 in Belém. That loss and damage is not also just about policy and maybe policy languages. It's about whether families who lose their homes, crops, and maybe tradition to climate disasters will finally get the support they need to maybe to rebuild the lost lives and maybe the lost homes. So yeah, thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion in the breakout sessions, and maybe we talk more on how we can advocate more on the loss and damage. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Teresa. That was a beautiful presentation and very critical analysis. Next up, I will be talking about Article 6. I'd like to mention that I didn't personally track Article 6 and develop the fact sheet. It was tracked by fellow ClimaTalk volunteers, Britta and Olivia, who weren't able to join today, and so I will be sharing about it on their behalf. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the rulebook for a global carbon market. And so some of the things we'll be focusing the conversation on. What is Article 6? What is being debated? Equity is a really big piece in this conversation. And then again, just like the other presentations, outlooks for COP30 as well. So we can go to the next slide. So Article 6 is broken into 3 parts, and essentially, again, it's this global carbon market that allows countries to trade emissions and meet their climate goals more cost effectively. Article 6.2 is for direct country-to-country trading. Article 6.4 is a new global carbon market supervised by the UN, and Article 6.8 is for non-market approaches like development aid. After finalizing the core rules at COP29, the focus on the Bonn SB62 negotiations shifted kind of to like the nitty-gritty details of implementation. Discussions revolved around making the system work in practice. So a lot of what the other speakers spoke about too, like how to actually get there. Reviewing the first batch of country reports, ironing out some technical issues, and debating how to ensure that the system is both fair and environmentally robust. So there was some progress made on the technical groundwork, but there were a lot of major political disagreements on things like revenue sharing and human rights safeguards, and those things remain unresolved. And so that sets the stage for some critical negotiations on the road towards COP30. We can go to the next slide. I've broken down here. Oh, maybe the slide after wait. No, we can stay on this slide. Sorry. Um, I've broken down here kind of like three main issues related to fairness and integrity. The main rulebook for Article 6 was finalized at COP29, and it kind of ended the era of like foundational negotiations. And the focus in Bonn SB62 was kind of all about operationalization. So moving again from theory to practice. And this means reviewing the first country reports, testing the new UN registry system, and dealing with the technical details as well. So essentially, the system is starting to move, but there are a lot of political and ethical questions that are still unanswered. We can go to the next slide. One of the major unresolved issues was revenue sharing. And so a lot of developing nations led by Zambia and others, they're demanding that a share of the revenue from all Article 6 trades, including 6.2 country-to-country trades, goes towards climate adaptation funds, but developed nations are resisting this. And then environmental integrity is also still a concern. Germany and the EU in general are pushing for very strong safeguards to prevent the double counting of emissions, while a lot of nations are more so prioritizing flexibility. If you don't know what double counting carbon credits means, basically, it's kind of when the same emission reduction or removal is claimed by two or more parties, or when a single carbon credit is sold multiple times. And so therefore it basically like inflates the overall climate benefits, and it undermines the integrity of the carbon market. And so you can see a diagram that kind of illustrates that. It's just this like double dipping essentially. Indigenous people's rights are also a critical point. There's still no mandatory requirement for countries to ensure that carbon market projects have the free uh, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, and this creates a significant human rights risk. So on the screen, I've included an example here, but you may have heard of Indigenous communities being displaced to plant more trees to create carbon offsets, or farmers being displaced so that their land can be used for a carbon trading project. And so that also is something that really needs to be front and center. If we go to the next slide. A positive step is the new international registry and the CDR platform, which are designed to track trades and flag inconsistencies in country reporting. However, the quality of reporting is still an issue. We saw in Bonn that countries are reporting in different ways, and that makes it hard to compare and ensure accountability. And so the overarching challenge is that we now have the tools and the strategies. We have the digital platforms needed for transparent and strong reporting, but we need that political like push and political will to enforce these high standards and clear rules for everyone. Um, so if we go to the next slide, looking ahead towards COP30 in Brazil, it is very clear that there will be some strong priorities for Article 6 and international carbon markets. First, COP30 must deliver a final decision on whether a share of proceeds for adaptation funding will apply to the Article 6.2 trades. This is a red line issue for a lot of countries, meaning that it is I guess, like a hard limit and very contentious point. Negotiators must also close the loopholes and establish mandatory requirements for protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in all carbon market projects. For many Indigenous and youth groups, we already saw outcry towards many pieces of the global carbon market last COP in Azerbaijan. And so we cannot compromise Indigenous sovereignty in the social and equity pieces of climate. And um, yeah, a lot of groups are advocating to push out of this like carbon tunnel vision that a lot of folks have. And additionally, the technical work must also continue to create standardized reporting formats and a robust review process to ensure that every carbon credit that is traded represents a real and verified emission reduction. Finally, many also hope to see the full launch of the new UN supervised crediting mechanism. It's also known as the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, or the PACM, including appointing its supervisory body and also approving methodologies for new project types. So next slide, some questions that folks may ask um, include, will developed nations concede on the issue of adaptation funding? Can a balance be struck between the demand for robust environmental and social safeguards, and then as well balancing the desire for like a more flexible and accessible market? So that's all from me for now. We'd love to hear from you. Um, Anything that have come up during the discussion that you have questions about. All of our speakers here and Emma, we're all here to answer any of your questions, to engage in dialogue. There's a couple of prompts on the board here. I guess I can read them out, but if you had any questions, ideas, comments you wanted to share, feel free to really just pop them into the chat or use the raise hand function. Um, yeah. Did anyone have any thoughts they might want to share, questions? Even if they just wanted to share like what topics resonate most with them, whether they were covered today or not, um, what topics you're looking forward to tracking at COP30. I think I'm interested in learning more about, I guess, how civil society and youth can keep momentum on advocating for things that matter to us ahead of COP30. I don't know if Karen or Teresa, you have anything to share on how how you're advocating ahead of COP30.
Mm. Yeah, sure. Maybe can you just repeat the question again? Maybe I shouldn't lose track.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, yeah, if there are any topics that really resonate with you, and if you can think of any ways that civil society and youth can really keep momentum, like pushing for the things that like matter to us, ahead of COP30.
Okay. I think youth can really play a powerful role in advocating for COP30 outcomes and maybe climate pole action. So, for me, I think first raising awareness and maybe sharing some information about climate impacts, loss and damage, and maybe national commitments in your communities or maybe just online, and also maybe participating in policy dialogues. So submitting maybe statements because like focusing more on the working groups. So those ones can make you maybe to share like your insights and maybe contribute to the youth policy as well. Maybe you can working as well with ClimaTalk and maybe Yungo. So it's really important as well in advocating for COP30.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm seeing a number of questions pop up in the chat now as well. First a
Annabelle,
comment.
may I just add to that?
Yes, of course.
One of the things that we're also doing on a more localized level as well in terms of climate finance is to just also raise the awareness of how important finance is. Climate action is I won't say there are a lot of things that need to be done in terms of climate finance, and just to mitigate a lot of damage that has been done, and be able to adapt local communities and be able to reduce just achieve over what is in the Paris Agreement. And without climate finance, all of that just remains ambition. And so one of the things that we're doing on a more very localized is going into, and that's also what most CSOs can do. Start where you are. What are the needs in your local communities? What are some of the things that, what are some of the impacts that your local community has had from climate? And then number two is to, like she had said, Teresa had said, to participate where you are. So one thing that we do is that we do mobilize young people in most of the rural areas, and then we mobilize them to talk to the chiefs, and then mobilize most of that feedback to talk to the government officers and policymakers, especially to have that kind of local contextual perspective when it comes to setting nationally determined commitments. And one of the things also is to have a liaison, to make sure that you have a form of liaison in the government offices that gives an update on what climate overall is nationally, what are some of the policies that are in place, what are some of the actions that the government is trying to take. And most of those actions are deduced from a more international frameworks. So that is one thing, to just keep track of what is going on and put a little pressure on both traditional and government leaders, ask for updates. That would be a good way, that a lot of civil societies, that would be a good start. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both for sharing. There's also a number of questions in the chat now. One of them, do you think that carbon capture technologies will be discussed as opposed to just emissions reductions, or any insights as to how that might fit in? I definitely think that will be discussed. There have been kind of some dialogue and conversations regarding CCUS, so carbon capture technologies in the past. I think that one of the main like focuses of that conversation is whether that technology is like a real solution or just like a delay tactic. Many countries kind of warn against like using it or like over relying on it. There are also issues with it not being like a perfect solution or perfect technology a lot of the times. There's carbon leakage that happens sometimes when you're kind of capturing that carbon and storing it deep underground. It can leak out, and it has happened in the past. But in general, it is one of the main questions is if like a company or a country, for example, captures carbon dioxide, can it sell that as a credit? And what are some like boundaries around carbon capture as well to prevent double counting or like low quality credits as well? So I think yeah, it definitely will be there will be a point of discussion at COP30 as well. It's also been brought up to like as a solution to decarbonize hard to decarbonize infrastructure that already exists. But a lot of parties, a lot of civil society and youth in general, I think, do really push for a bigger focus on just like the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, as well as like reducing emissions instead of trying to, focus on solutions where you're capturing emissions and putting them somewhere else. Okay. If you have any other questions, please keep them coming. I think I can read out the next one. Any opinions on the role of non-market approaches such as reforestation for Article 6, especially in regards to issues like uh, permanence and the issue of including REDD plus in Article 6? Thoughts on the Tropical Forest Fund at COP30? Do you think carbon credits and assigning an economic value to nature preservation will bring about effective progress? I think I can speak to the second one first, but kind of assigning this like economic value to something like a rainforest, for example. Again, this kind of like ties into that risk of like commodifying nature and reducing it to tons of carbon. So when we, I guess, like quantify the economic value of a rainforest, or we like say, this forest like represents this many tons of carbon, it can whether intentionally or unintentionally ignore a lot of like biodiversity and cultural and spiritual values, which is where like the indigenous rights piece comes in as well. Um, so yeah, I can't speak, I'm not an expert on that. I can't speak to how like effective it will be in terms of like driving down emissions or creating like more offsets or credits. But I think that in general, a lot of like market-based solutions where we're focusing on the return on investment or we're focusing on like environmentalism through like a financial lens, it does often have a track record of pretty low integrity. So that's where a lot of things like double counting, over crediting, and like carbon leakage come in as well. And a lot of credits that we do see in the market today, unfortunately, don't represent real or permanent carbon reductions. Again, not even considering like the human rights violations and risks that are often a part of these big projects. And so, yeah, I think that carbon markets often can let big emitters kind of just like purchase offsets instead of cutting down emissions. And this can um, delay like a lot of the deep systemic change we need. So I think a really big thing to remember is that like this is very urgent. And so we should be spending all of our time and energy focusing or like, yeah, injecting this like same urgency that's needed. And maybe like an economic solution or a market-based solution isn't what should be a priority in a lot of our discussions. So I guess that's my take on it. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, whether you are a presenter or you're in the audience. If you have any thoughts on it, feel free to unmute and speak up as well.
Yeah, I think I can share on the T triple F. So for the financial incentives alone, I think they are not enough. So for the for the T triple F to really work, I think it needs some strong monitoring and maybe to make sure that the forests are actually protected. And maybe it must also involve some local communities, since you mentioned some that about indigenous people. So those are the people who also play the role in managing their lands. So it is also important that these funds maybe shouldn't repress other climate actions like maybe reducing emissions, but instead maybe support them as well. So in short, I think giving forests an economic value can help drive progress, but also it has to be combined with good governance as well to work. So and support as well for the people who depend on these forests. So if done maybe properly, it can be a powerful tool as well in the fight against climate change.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. We're almost approaching time. If anyone has any last thoughts they'd like to share. Okay. If not, I'd just like to thank everybody so much for coming today. It was really great to see all of you. I really enjoyed reading your questions. A lot of them are very challenging and critical and thoughtful questions, which is very hopeful to see that we have so many young people asking these questions and posing these towards like NGOs, policymakers, decision makers. Um, yeah, I'm really glad to see all of you today. Don't forget to follow Climate Talk on our socials if you want to stay updated. We will be having more upcoming pre-COP30 events as well as our COP30 coverage. So if you'd ever like to chat about any of that, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Yeah, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are.